Welcome to the European Equation.
Join us as we analyze the critical issues that shape the future of the European continent.
We are your hosts, Stanislas Salavert
and Til Gosch. So before we start off with this episode, we would really like to set the scene and talk a little bit about the topic of this episode. And when Stan and I were planning out this podcast, we were thinking, the world seems constantly preoccupied between the war in Ukraine, American protectionism, and an increasingly competitive Chinese state. But for this episode specifically, there was one country that was in the news, and that was Greenland.
Yeah, and what we were thinking about it is that, in essence, between itself, the Panama Canal, and Canada, all three of them face a broadly similar situation, actually, which has been initiated by the US. And what we're seeing a little bit, and what we're going to try to discuss as well throughout this conversation, is that the US administration seems to follow a bit more of a transactional US foreign policy, looking for some clear short-term wins through bilateral agreements at the expense of longer-term alliances, norms, and multilateral deals. If we want, we could even say, to a certain degree, that the rules-based order as we know it could be argued as dying.
So for this episode, today we want to discuss how President Donald Trump has expressed a clear desire to acquire the island in the north, citing its strategic importance for the US and its resource potential. And of course, this has led to some heightened diplomatic tensions between the US, Denmark, and Greenland. And in response to that, Denmark has engaged in a series of talks with both the US and Greenland on expanding deals, but also on Greenlandic independence. On the side, France has engaged in discussions about potentially deploying troops to Greenland to counteract these recent US ambitions.
Yeah, so it's just, in essence, we're seeing a lot of commotion around the island.
Yeah, and on that note, welcome to the inaugural episode of the European Equation. We have chosen an interesting topic, and to be honest, we were quite starstruck when we went into the office where we are recording this episode.
Yeah.
So, Stan, what office are we sitting in right now?
Well, when we went through the hall and then saw pictures of this individual with George Bush and other great American presidents and other big leaders, it was actually Anders Fogh Rasmussen, which is really, really crazy. And we're also talking to a fantastic person today. His name is Rasmus Grand Berthelsen. Til, do you maybe want to present him?
Yes, Rasmus is a senior director at Rasmussen Global and an external lecturer at Copenhagen Business School. And with him, we want to discuss the situation in Greenland, its strategic significance, Denmark's position, and how the US and Trump's interest with the world's largest island actually take part in shaping the megatrends that are affecting European nations' grand strategies.
So thank you, Rasmus, and it's a pleasure really to have you as the first speaker here on this podcast. Before we go a little bit into the whole topic of Greenland and everything, we'd really like to hear a little bit about yourself, your professional background, and your career, what your job at Rasmussen Global consists of, and what you work on specifically with Danish and transatlantic policy issues.
Sure, thanks. Thanks. Good to be part of this new exciting podcast. I'm very excited about what we will be speaking on over the next 45 minutes or so. To start off introducing myself, I mean, my career has basically been one job since I graduated. I graduated from CBS and the SEMS Masters in Management, and since then I've been working at Rasmussen Global the past 7.5 years. Right now I lead an office of 10 people here in Copenhagen, and we serve clients in a range of industries on energy, security, defense, space, telco, tech, a range of topics. What sort of unites them all is the geopolitical stuff that we advise about. And as you might imagine, especially since 2022, business has been quite booming with us, which is also why we're now I think, around 35 people at Rasmussen Global, with offices in Copenhagen, Brussels, and Kiev, and a bit of other senior advisors placed around in Europe: Berlin, Stockholm, Paris, Madrid, London.
Okay, and actually, what inspired you to get into this line of work? Because it's also quite specific, I want to say.
Yeah. It's. I mean, especially when I started, this was a super niche field. This was this was. I mean, this was right after Brexit and the first election of Donald Trump. That's when some of the initial jittery about the rules-based world order were not necessarily true, and we weren't all thinking about, this had been the end of history and all of this. Now we saw some cracks, but we thought this was just like a small rise in populism or whatever. Now clearly, I think we see a world in flux, and that's sort of also what sucked me into this career of geopolitical advisory, or what you want to call it.
Thank you, Rasmus, for this brief introduction. And I think for the beginning, it would be interesting for our listeners to talk about the geopolitical significance of Greenland. It is not the first time that the US has put out their interest for this island. They did have their eyes on Greenland for a long time, from William H. Seward's strategic considerations to Harry Truman's offer to buy the island, and of course, most recently, Trump's renewed interest. It seems that the autonomous Danish territory has been seen as far more than just an Arctic outpost. So why would the US be interested in Greenland, and how has this evolved over the recent years?
So, I mean, you can obviously also go back to, you mentioned Truman. I think you can even go back to Monroe and talk about the Monroe Doctrine and sort of that whatever happens in the Americas is the United States interest, and they deal with that. Greenland has been the odd one out in that, given the Danish sort of previous ownership, now control of its foreign and security policy. And I think, there are a few, if you take that up until now, I think the most significant part that the US has, or the most significant interest that the US has, is missile defense. If you have a globe at home and you turn it around, you'll see that Russia is actually quite close to the US if they shoot across the Arctic. That both goes for sort of normal missiles, but also ballistic missile systems. So for that, the US is, of course, quite worried that there's not enough ISR, sort of reconnaissance, let's say, and surveillance capabilities on Greenland to detect if Russia were to send a missile or a drone or any other things. Same goes for space capabilities. That's specifically for ballistic missiles, but also in general surveillance of that. And then I think there's also a general sort of US posture in the Arctic, where they feel they don't really have that. I'm sure we'll come back to what they could have done and what Denmark could have done, but at least that's where we are right now. On top of that, I think with the ice melting and all of that, you do increasingly see shipping routes going that way. In the summer months, you already have them. Soon you'll be able to have them year round. I think you can cut. It's like 15 days or something from China to Europe. This would be in through Norway. Instead of going through the Suez Canal, you could just sail north. So there's a big sort of commercial interest in that. But of course, as we know with Russia and China, shipping is not only commercial, there's also quite a lot of military elements in that. I don't even have to mention the cables being cut recently in the Baltic Sea and all of that. So there is also, and I know this is especially if you talk to conservative think tanks in the US, they've been talking for a long time about doing a freedom of navigation operation in the Arctic, basically saying, if you plan on doing anything, just know that the US has the capabilities, the naval capabilities to mess with you. And obviously Greenland would be an important part of that, not just, I mean, the surveillance, but also the ability to conduct sort of naval exercises from Greenlandic territory.
But do we then also see, for example, the US also investing in those capabilities? We read recently as well that Russia has been investing heavily in icebreakers. Yeah. Is that something then that the US is also following or suit with?
Well, I mean, US obviously invests much more than Russia, and definitely much more than Europe in its defense, and that also includes Arctic capabilities, of course. But when you come to Greenland, I think the issue is, I mean, you have the Denmark, or let's go back a step more. The reason why the US has its access to Greenland the way it does came in the Second World War when the Danish ambassador to the US sort of went rogue and cut a deal with the Americans to give away Greenland for sort of American support, or some American support for the European effort in Second World War. After that, it was more formalized in the 1951 agreement, sort of between Denmark and the US, which gave the US, or authorized the US to have quite extensive military presence and conduct military activities on Greenland. And this has been the Danish position ever since, more or less. I mean, there was a slight period in the late 70s, start 80s, where we weren't as good friends with the US, but in general, this has been the position of Denmark, that you allow the US to do whatever the hell they want on Greenland, more or less. Now, the issue, of course, now is that when the US then says Denmark hasn't been doing enough on Greenland, Denmark hasn't invested enough in Greenland security and so on. If you are that worried about it, they could have just done it themselves. I'm pretty sure Denmark wouldn't have said no.
Okay, but like for me, from that point of view, the next natural question would be if Denmark allows like the United States to do whatever they want in a certain way, and the biggest interest of the United States being reconnaissance and surveillance systems in the Arctic, it really boils down to the question, why is that something that couldn't be done in collaboration with NATO, and why would Trump instead now just try to buy the island instead?
Yeah, well, if I could answer that question to you, I think I would be on call with the Prime Minister right now. I think that question is exactly sort of goes to what is at stake now between Denmark and the US, because there's a lack of understanding what it really is the US administration wants to. Because if you talk to people in the Ministry of Defense, Foreign Affairs, PM's office, they say, as long as it's just a security thing, we can handle it. I mean, it's about, we already agreed we will spend more money, then you just spend more money in the Arctic, and if the US is happy with that, fair enough. Or you just allow them to build more capabilities themselves, build more military bases, and so on. That's possible. We can manage that, and we might even get other NATO allies, Finland, Norway, Sweden, to invest, say, in satellite capabilities or whatever for surveilling the high north. That would be fairly easy. The issue is if it's really control, control of Greenland as a territory that the US wants, because this breaks with the rules-based order. In essence, it also breaks with, if you go to the extreme, it breaks with NATO's NATO's Article 5. It breaks with the UN Charter. I mean, this is, that's where you go into a very, very different situation. And I should say, I mean, this is quite extreme for someone who's always been backing the international rules-based order and has been upholding that order as a world's policeman, or whatever you want to call it. But if it's really true that Trump wants Greenland just for the territory of it, just for the 52nd state or whatever he wants to have, what would then keep Putin from saying, well, then I want Ukraine and I want it just for security reasons? Or keep Xi Jinping from taking Taiwan and saying, I take it because of security reasons? without actually having any real security concerns, because those can, like I said, in the case of Greenland, they can be addressed. And if that's what the US wants to, they will find an open ear in Copenhagen to address those issues.
Yeah, and speaking of China and Russia, Greenland has been the subject of foreign influence. More specifically, China, I believe, has also tried to invest in Greenland, but was met until now with a unified front from Denmark and the US, which I think does provide a form of deterrence for foreign influence. Do you have any comments in regards to that?
No, exactly. I mean, the most clear example is when China wanted to build an airport in Greenland. I don't remember the name. It's in Greenlandic, and I should actually remember. Anyways, they were keen on investing in an airport, owning that airport. Denmark was relatively concerned with that. The Americans were super concerned with that. The way that works is quite obviously that the Americans call the Danes and say, you cannot let that happen. But there's no mechanism for Denmark to do that, because we only control Greenland's foreign and security policy. And if this was considered a domestic or trade or commercial sort of policy issue, then there's no way Denmark can say no to Greenland taking that investment into the airport. So what ends up happening is that the Danish foreign minister has to travel to Greenland with a big bag of cash to outbid the Greenlanders. Because the only way you can win that is just by putting more money on the table to outbid the Chinese. And that's what happened there. I know this is one of the things the chairman of the Danish Foreign Affairs Committee says. Greenland really does need an investment screening mechanism like we have in the entirety of Europe. In the US, it's called the CFIUS. Because as long as it doesn't have that, it's quite open to investments from anyone. Also, people with or countries with more strategic and let's say security interests than pure commercial interests.
On a different note, we have now talked a little bit about like the strategic considerations behind the potential acquisition of Greenland and its geopolitical significance. But how do the Greenlanders view the whole topic? How do they see the US interests? And with regard to becoming the 51st state of America, do the people of Greenland want to become a US citizen?
So, yeah, a couple points on that, because I think, first of all, the most recent poll we have from Greenland says that 85% of Greenlanders do not want to become a US state. Yeah. There's an election in Greenland that's been pushed already to March, which is quite soon. As far as we know, there will not be a referendum on independence within that election, but we already see one of the big government parties having internal discussions about whether they should run on a ticket to have a referendum eventually. The sort of David Cameron model, which I'm not sure would work. I mean, we had pretty bad sort of experiences with promising a referendum eventually, and then people actually keep you up to it, and we know what happened with Britain. But this we'll see what happens on that. Another point, of course, is there's a big sort of risk of election interference. I think it's quite open the US is willing to do that bluntly and with open eyes. I think they already are sort of putting in the prepositions to do that. We had a fun numbers game at the office the other day where we discussed if the last time Greenland had elections, they around 20,000 people voted. If you pay 20,000 people $1 million, each person becomes as rich as a Norwegian in terms of the current sovereign wealth fund that the Norwegians have. So you give each person voting in Greenland $1 million, you can buy that vote for $20 billion, which is half of what Twitter cost Elon Musk. So essentially, I mean, that could, it's not, because there are only 50,000 people, 56,000 people, and fewer of them vote, you essentially have an election that's very, very easy to rig. Now, and here's my point on the more technical parts of it, because since 2009, Greenland has had the Self-Governing Act, which means they're an autonomous territory and all of this. If Greenland were to vote on independence, they don't just get independence. What Greenlanders vote on is an enablement of their government to start negotiations with the Danish government. And only when the Danish government can agree with the Greenlanders on an independence agreement, they get independence. And obviously, if the US were to, rigorously interfere with the election, the Danish government would not sort of acknowledge that as a fair sort of independence vote. And hence there would not be independence. So you most these days you hear the Danish Prime Minister say quite often that all discussions about Greenlandic independence starts and ends in Nuuk. Well, in reality, it starts in Nuuk, but it ends in Copenhagen. And it's only when Greenland and Nuuk and Copenhagen can agree to the terms of independence that there is actual independence.
Yeah, and I think it's very clear how Denmark, to a certain degree right now, is walking quite the tightrope with both the US on one side and then with Greenland on the other. So I think the next natural question is, how has Denmark navigated interest in Greenland while avoiding straining ties with Washington?
So I think, you've probably also seen sort of Donald Trump saying what he does, especially J.D. Vance saying Denmark's not being a good ally. This really hurt sort of the Danish PM, but also the Danish political establishment, because Denmark does consider itself at least one of the closest allies of the US. We were in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq together. We were even on their side in when the Germans wanted Nord Stream 2. We had the cables outside of Danish waters surveilled, and we allowed the Americans to tap those cables and surveil European leaders. We're that close to the Americans, and so when they go out and say we're not being a good ally, it's like it's rude to say the least. For that, I think the president and the vice president and whatever it is can have whatever opinions they want to have, but at least the Danish interpretation of this is also that it's a bit of a disrespect to the office, because it's a disrespect of the historic relationship between the countries, and it might not fit J.D. Vance or Donald Trump's agenda, but at least the words of saying you're a bad ally just sort of tears decades of work apart. That being said, I think Denmark's strategy is right now, or let's say it in another way, when Trump came to power even the second time, most Danish politicians said, we'll handle it. We speak, we can also speak direct and we can manage that. Now Denmark is at the, the not so funny end of whatever the Trump administration wants to do. And that clearly baffled, the entire government and the political establishment in Copenhagen. People did not see it coming, even though some would say they should have, given his already claims to Greenland in 2019. Now the strategy clearly is to keep very quiet. Handle this through diplomatic channels as much as you can. Do not pick a public fight with Donald Trump, because if you do it, he will do everything in his power to win that battle. The analysis seems to be that the longer you can stretch this out, the bigger the chance that he will find something else to care about. That be the Panama Canal, it be Canada, Gaza, building, taking over the Gaza Strip or whatever. That seems to be the strategy. Whether it will work, we'll have to see. But at least that's the way they planned on doing it.
Yeah, do you think there's a reason why the US actually picked on Denmark as one of the first people to kind of pick a fight with, especially within Europe? Because it seems, as you mentioned, very rude to pick on one of your closest allies, and it doesn't really make sense. You'd kind of want them to be on your side and to try to support you, especially within the European Union. If you have like then an ally from within, it would make a little bit more sense, if that makes sense.
I think on that, we can have many theories. We can have many, think long strategies of why exactly is it them. It's because they are one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. It's because they have a social democratic government. Is it because, they're becoming sort of hawkish in terms of Europe, and hence could be, there could be many analyses. Honestly, I think some of it is Donald Trump remembering in 2019 when he offered to buy Greenland, and he was told very publicly and very rudely, no, forget about it, you orange, not directly, but that was kind of implied, you're stupid, forget it. He ends up calling the Danish PM a nasty woman, and this role sort of still sits in him. If you ask me, I think it's more of a personal thing. It's the McKinley, which he did in his inauguration speech. We want to expand territories, and he looks at the beautiful island up in up north and looks at it and says, "I want that." I don't think there's a big strategic sort of calculation behind why exactly it's Denmark he's picking on.
But to a certain degree, I feel like we're getting a déjà vu from 2019. But if there's no greater strategy for picking on Denmark specifically, what do you think has changed since the first Trump administration for the claims now to be taken more seriously?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think I was myself in the U.S. At this time in 2016. I was actually at a Hillary Clinton sort of watch party, and everyone it was a given that Hillary Clinton would win that election. No one thought Trump would win, not even himself, not his team, not anyone. This was more of a, if you ask me, this was more of a marketing campaign than it was an election campaign. He ends up winning it. Completely unprepared, enters the White House. You can read it. I mean, he said this also, that he goes to Washington. He has no idea how the game works, who has power, who do you put into positions, and so that's why the Trump 1.0 administration ends up being a total mess. The people who go in and out all the time, the people who publicly disagree on all this stuff, and nothing really gets done. It's just it's Trump's tweets, and it's people running around, doing stuff that they used to, kind of, but not doing it, or doing it in a bit of a different way because of Trump and all of this. Now you're in the second term, where clearly there's a more of a strategy behind it. There's clearly he knows what he wants. He has some clear sort of allies. He's gotten to know Washington over the last many years, and clearly there's a plan behind it. He wants something with the presidency. You can see that in the executive's orders he signed already, but you can also see that there is sort of changes being made, quite fundamental changes to the way the U.S. government works. More specifically, I think if you look at his cabinet picks, I would say the Trump you see now is the sort of the commercial Trump. If you look at the Department of State, Department of Defense, those are usually your Secretary of State is usually your important pick, your diplomatic sort of whatever. For that, you have Marco Rubio, which is a bit of a show guy, or not really considered a serious player in that sense. Same goes for Pete Hegseth at Department of Defense. I mean, he's a Fox News TV host who spent 2 weeks in the U.S. military or whatever. I mean, it's not really serious on those posts, and those guys are not hard hitters, especially in Washington. But then you look at the economic positions, the Department of Commerce, Department of Trade, and the Treasury. There he's put in very serious people. And so if you ask me, and this is, if you read, you can read all J.D. Vance's stuff, he's very much onto this, but it seems the general sort of MAGA analysis is that throughout, or since the Second World War, the U.S. has used its economic power for foreign policy objectives. That's specifically because of the dollar. with the dollar, you can kind of, you control the only real money reserve in the world, so you can sanction people. You can sanction countries, you can sanction individuals, and you can use that to achieve your foreign policy goals. The issue of that, of course, is that the dollar rises to a point where it doesn't make sense to keep any manufacturing jobs in the US. So you've essentially sold out the middle class for foreign policy objectives. It's a bit, it's a simple analysis, but that's some of the stuff that they really have against Hillary Clinton, for instance, and also against sort of the Democratic policymakers, but also the swamp in Washington, so to speak. It seems that what Trump 2.0 is doing is the exact opposite. Is that he wants to use his foreign policy power to obtain economic gains. That goes for Panama, that goes for Canada, it goes for Greenland, it goes for, all the threats he's now using with tariffs, with all of this. Clearly he's using it to get what he wants economically. So that's that's a bit how I read or how I see the way they analyze it. And clearly I think it's the commercial sort of push that Trump has put in the new administration that's the clearest example of that.
Yeah, I think the idea of commercial Trump really speaks to me. And you already talked about like the different people you put into the ministries. And of course, we have the newly created Department of Government Efficiency under the control of Elon Musk. So I think on that note, it might be interesting to talk a little bit about Elon Musk's role in this new Trump administration and his interest in the European continent, because we do see some entanglement of economic and political interests with the new Trump administration. So especially on the economic side, Elon Musk's Tesla has a large share on the market for electric vehicles. Then we have X. The European Union is investigating to what extent X violates EU law. But at the same time, they, of course, then have to kind of fear political retaliation from Trump's side. So how do you see Elon Musk's role in this new Trump administration?
Yeah, I think clearly there are oligarchical structures forming in the US. I'm not keen on calling it an oligarchy because I think there are still certain democratic railguards in place, and I think we should be careful on labeling countries with this sort of stuff. But you see some tendencies, right? You also see it in terms of the executive power that the president has right now, that he's using again commercially, economically, and so on, which obviously is also why the big tech CEOs were all at his inauguration, which they weren't in 2016. I think that's an obvious one, and they can see how they need to play nice with the new US administration. If you ask me, then tech is probably going to be the most sort of the biggest issue in transatlantic relation when you go, beyond security, I should say. Security, the most obvious one. I think we see that taking place already with Ukraine. But in terms of your question, I would say you're seeing the contours now to much more confrontation between the American tech world because it's such a powerful and such a let's say economically important sector in the US, or at least it has become over the past 20 years, compared to what it is in Europe, and the sort of the tit for tat that will be going on about US lending their innovations and all of that to Europe compared to Europe regulating them and so on will be quite interesting to follow.
Yeah, so we've discussed a little bit about economic Trump. And what we tend to see, I want to say, with Trump is that he doesn't really enjoy talking with multilateral organizations. He much prefers to talk bilaterally. And we saw that actually reflected, funnily enough, in his choice of invitation for the inauguration, where, for example, Giorgia Meloni was invited, but not Ursula von der Leyen. I guess from there, for me, the question really is, how do you see Trump as an actor influencing the EU? Specifically, do you think it's going to lead to stronger or weaker European cohesion and multilateralism, if that's something that can be said?
I mean, you see it. If we continue on the tech, you see it very clearly that what was set up between the EU and the US was the Transatlantic Technology Council. Transatlantic. I think EU-US Trade and Technology Council is the name. This was basically to deconflict on anything that had to deal with tech regulations, sort of also government support for tech, all of this. It worked relatively well. I mean, even when there were frictions under the Biden administration between the tech world and the Europeans or regulators and so on, it worked. This is like completely scrapped by Trump. They've never met since Trump came into power and probably won't. That, I think, is quite emblematic of the way Trump wants to deal. If you go ask the new High Representative of the EU, Kaja Kallas, she has tried numerous times to get a meeting with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in the US, her counterpart, but he refuses. He refuses to go to meet her in Europe, and he refuses to have her visit, simply because there's a sense that the Trump administration does not even recognize the EU. They don't think it's. They're not saying this directly, but the signals they send is that they don't think the EU, the European Union, is legitimate. They only want to talk to governments, national governments. They think this superstructure of an EU, which is sort of a quasi-multilateral organization, is not worth spending time on. I think that might be, if they're successful in this, that could be what it's sort of a divide and conquer strategy, right? So you can speak to each country individually, and it's much easier to cut deals with small players who are relatively weak compared to one big strong player. But of course, I mean, then the European response to that could go either way. And the issue in Europe, of course, is that you always have an election upcoming. Right now, there's a German elections coming soon. Quite relatively soon after that, we have French presidential elections and so on. What we see now is probably the Germans will choose a conservative leadership, which tilts more towards, let's say, Meloni in Italy and sort of all of that. France will have to see, but you know that there's a relatively big chance Marine Le Pen gets the presidency, and in that case you have sort of centers right leaning, some more than others, big governments in Europe, France, Germany, Italy. Then you have Poland with Donald Tusk, who's the only liberal left. But I mean, if you know Poland, I think they would agree with at least some of Meloni's points, even though they're not the same political family. So in that case, there might be much more unity towards Trump, and so on. So I would say the Trump administration clearly wants to divide and conquer Europe. The response from Europe is what's going to decide this.
What do you see Europe's kind of the decision to be really?
I hope we stay together, but I fear we don't. I have a sense that, you know, Europe is never really up to the task when it comes to these things. I think for that we would need institutional reform. We would need qualified majority voting or just simple majority in foreign affairs decisions. We simply cannot run a continent and be a geopolitical player if any single country like Cyprus or Estonia or Denmark or whatever could block any decision that we want to take in terms of foreign policy, because that just enables everyone else to divide and conquer. And China's been using that tactic for a long time. Clearly now the US is doing the same.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about commercial Trump and also now just about European cohesion and the struggles of making unified decisions within the European Union. So for me, the next natural question is directed at how the EU is going to deal with the new Trump administration. When we think back to the first Trump administration, 2018, when Trump imposed tariffs on aluminum and steel, the EU acted quite quickly and unified on imposing similar tariffs on US goods. So when we now take this into the present, and look at the war in Ukraine, look at the issue in Greenland, how might those issues be a window into the future of how the EU is going to deal with Trump administration 2.0?
So the issue for Europe in that is that we can say a lot, and you've done that. If we start with Greenland, you've had, I mean, the Danish PM took a tour around Europe, Berlin, Paris, Brussels. He also went to Madrid and all of this, London. Talks behind closed doors, of course, with leaders, and they all come out and say, we're behind Denmark 100%, blah, blah. In reality, if the US were to... I mean, it's still an extreme scenario. It sounds even absurd to say it, but if the US were to take Greenland by force, do you really think Germany would come and actually put troops on Greenland?
Yeah, probably.
It seems unrealistic.
I mean, the French will. It's a bit like the French. You know, the NATO French ambassador. She went out right after Trump made his first statement about Greenland. She said, "This is an Article 4 thing," because that's the one where you just get the countries around and discuss what to do. Clearly, no one did it because it's a play from the. I mean. And it's the same. I think the French also suggested putting actual troops on Greenland, but do you really think they will? I don't. So that's on Greenland. If the US really wants to take it, they probably just will take it. It would be illegal and all of this, but I mean, what would we be able to do? On Ukraine, I think it's also quite obvious that whatever happens. I mean, right now they're discussing at Munich Security Conference. Trump has had his call with Putin. They've informed Zelensky. I mean, we can talk a lot about terrible negotiation tactics, but the issue for Europe there is that we will not be able to defend Ukraine without the US. They have the intelligence capabilities and they have the more advanced weapon systems, including Patriot systems, HIMARS, and all of this, that Ukraine desperately needs to survive. If the US decides to leave, that's it. We will probably we can hold it for some time. We can send, but we're not there in terms of supporting Ukraine. Now, if we were to find, let's say, what the US now wants in Ukraine is for Europe to take a much bigger part of the burden. Right now, it's like some say 50-50, some say 60% Europe, 40% US support. Donald Trump would say it's much more US support, but anyways, you would probably shift it towards 80% Europe, 20% US only for the most important parts. Or you would even say 100%, but then Europeans pay the last 20% for US, and then they deliver the stuff to Ukraine. But I mean, even in that scenario, you don't really have any significant security guarantees for Ukraine. It is only sort of the NATO Article 5 security guarantee that's the only real repellent for Russia, because they know they've been dealing with Europe for a long, long time. They also know that even the Brits and the French can't agree on their nuclear doctrine. So if you were to put on a security guarantee, which in the end of the escalation ladder is a nuclear attack, if you were to put that together, it probably would not be very compelling or very trustworthy. You could end with European troops on the ground, not necessarily on the front lines, but you could put European troops on in Western Ukraine and around Kiev and southern Ukraine around the important ports and all of that. Plus, you could add some sort of some missile defense just around the border, which says if Russia were to attack again after a ceasefire, we would clamp down on you. But all of this would be something that Russia could calculate with, and where they could potentially game it around instead of actually sort of being afraid of what would happen. The only thing that keeps that is the US, because they are so much stronger than Europe. And it would take 4, 5, 6, 7 years for Europe to get where we could, credibly deter Russia to the point that the US currently is. Whether we want to spend that much money and whether we get there, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, because I guess that goes into then a question of military procurement strategies and how Europe, I guess, has very diversified programs, but not necessarily very homogenized programs, and even the Germans and the French can't agree on a fighter jet of like a 6th generation fighter, or let alone a tank. So I guess, I mean, within even those kind of specific examples, do you see a situation where Europe could, to a certain degree, work together on military procurement a little bit more in depth and try to maybe bridge a gap? Or do you see it as kind of doomed to fail in a certain way?
I think definitely, I mean, there's a big argument like you just made for joint procurement and basically putting more money into the same fund. You have I think that's also what the new EU Commissioner for Defense Industry, which it is called now, will be doing. And I think that's a big part of his new job, is to convince European governments to do joint tenders and so on. Another mechanism that will probably get that going is the joint borrowing at the European level, because that would then send out money that the EU can spend and not just member states. The issue, of course, is that the EU can't tell member states, now you have to do joint procurement with the French or with the Germans or with the Greek or whatever. It is up to national procurement agencies. It's considered a national competence, and hence, you in the end, it's a national tender that goes out. Now, I don't think the procurement issue is the main issue for Europe. I think that's much more finding a structure that works within Europe, because I mean, in the end, you can have different battalions and different parts. They might use different weapon systems and so on. But if a big group can use this weapon system and another group can use this weapon system, and they all are trained in it, that should be fine. I mean, in the end, a missile is a missile, and whether it's French or German, and works in different ways, as long as there's someone to fire it, it should work. The issue, of course, is that you will have to train Europe within a NATO structure and do enough missions and training missions and outstations and all of this in order for Europe to actually be credible and have sort of its own pillar within NATO, so we're not always dependent on the Americans, because that is in effect the Americans who run the alliance today. It's them who lead the main missions. If we were to go to war with the Russians, it would be the Americans who would lead the war. If that weren't happening, you would have the French and the Brits fight over who would be leading. And clearly there's an issue with the EU and Brexit and so on. So I think the biggest issue for Europe is to build up that pillar within NATO where Europe can actually act independently.
Yeah, so what a fantastic way to end the discussion. Rasmus, unfortunately our time has run out, but a great big thank you for you to have joined us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we've learned very, very much a lot. And yeah.
It's been a pleasure joining, and good luck with the rest of the podcast. It's an exciting project.
Yeah, also from my side, a big thank you to you, Rasmus, but also to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the European Equation. We certainly enjoyed recording it. If you like our show, please follow us on Spotify and follow us on LinkedIn for more behind-the-scenes content. And if you have anyone who would be interested to be on our show, to talk to us, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on LinkedIn or individually. And with that, I conclude this first episode of the European Equation, and I hope you tune in next time.